Hey there, ready to dive into the wild world of global trade.
Today we're zeroing in on Denmark's position amidst some serious trade tensions.
Specifically, those brewing between the US and China.
You've provided us with some really insightful reports from Dansk Industry.
And some Danish trade statistics.
Good picks.
I'll break those down.
And see what they reveal about Denmark's economic future,
You've got it. Think of us as your trade navigators.
helping you chart a course through these choppy waters.
I like it. So, before we get into the nitty-gritty,
Let's set the scene a bit.
trade tensions, especially between heavyweights like the US and China,
Aren't just headlines,
they have a ripple effect. And for a small open economy like Denmark,
which relies heavily on trade.
those ripples can feel more like tidal waves.
Precisely.
And that's where Dansk Industry, or DI, as they're often called, they're a major player in the Danish business world.
And they've done some serious modeling on potential trade war scenarios.
Think of it like economic stress testing.
Okay, let's unpack those scenarios.
They've got a hard scenario and a soft scenario, right?
Right.
The hard scenario is the worst-case scenario.
A full-blown trade war
Wolfrak pictures significantly higher tariffs between the US and China.
with the EU caught in the crossfire.
DI's analysis estimates this could cost Denmark a staggering 85 billion DKK.
And 30,000 jobs.
Wow, 85 billion.
That's not just a dip in the economy, that's a full-on belly flop.
And I imagine the aftershocks would be pretty rough, too.
Absolutely.
DI highlights some pretty bleak short-term consequences.
Plummeting consumer confidence, something akin to what we saw in 2008.
Central banks tightening their belts.
And this domino effect ultimately dragging down the global economy.
It's a sobering picture.
So not great.
But they also have that soft scenario, right? What happens if things just kind of stay as they are,
With these lingering tensions.
even in the soft scenario?
Where things don't escalate into a full-blown trade war.
DI still projects significant costs.
Around 18 billion DKK.
6,000 jobs lost.
It's a stark reminder that even the threat of a trade war
That uncertainty hanging in the air.
can have a real economic impact.
So no matter how you slice it, Denmark's in a tight spot.
But here's where DI's analysis took a turn I wasn't expecting.
They found that the trade war between the US and China
Actually poses a bigger threat to Denmark than, say, a conflict between the US and the EU.
That's kind of counterintuitive, isn't it?
It might seem that way at first, but it all comes down to understanding the intricacies of global trade networks.
DI points to two key reasons for this.
First, if you're a Chinese business facing higher tariffs from the US.
You're going to start looking for other markets.
And guess what?
The EU, with its relatively open economy, starts looking pretty attractive.
So suddenly, Danish companies are facing a surge in competition.
Not from across the Atlantic, but from the other side of the world,
So it's like this economic butterfly effect.
where a trade war in one part of the world can have unintended consequences on countries thousands of miles away.
That's the thing about global trade.
It's interconnected in ways we often don't even realize.
The second reason DI highlights is the sheer scale of the US-China trade relationship.
The tariff changes involved in that conflict are simply much larger than those between the US and the EU.
So the potential for disruption is magnified.
Okay, that makes sense.
We've got this big picture warning from DI.
Trade wars are bad news for Denmark, especially the US-China standoff.
But let's get into the weeds a bit.
And look at the actual trade data for 2023.
You know what they say.
Numbers don't lie.
They paint a pretty complex picture, though.
One that requires careful interpretation.
For example, in 2023, China was Denmark's 7th largest export market,
Accounting for about 4.2% of total export.
which translates to roughly 80.1 billion DKK.
And the US?
I'm guessing they were at the top of the list.
They were indeed.
The US was Denmark's top export market in 2023.
Gobbling up 15.3% of Danish exports.
A cool 292.1 billion DKK.
So at first glance, you might think.
Well, the US is clearly the more important trade partner, right?
But here's where things get interesting.
Those same statistics show that while Denmark's exports to China actually decreased by 6% in 2023.
Exports to the US surged by a whopping 25.3%.
That's right.
And that seemingly contradictory trend underscores the very complexities we're discussing.
Despite the trade tensions and uncertainties surrounding the US-China relationship,
Demand for Danish goods in the US, particularly in certain sectors,
remained incredibly strong.
it's almost like the trade war drumbeat had the opposite effect.
Maybe it even fueled US demand for Danish products.
It's certainly possible.
And it highlights the importance of looking beyond the headlines.
And delving into the specific dynamics at play within each trade relationship.
Okay, I'm hooked.
Let's dig into some concrete examples
What kind of products are we talking about here?
that's driving those numbers.
Well, in 2023, pharmaceuticals were a major player,
They were Denmark's top export to both China and the U.S.
bringing in 16.17 billion.
and 22.83 billion DKK, respectively.
So medicine is big business for Denmark.
No matter who's squabbling on the global stage.
Are there any other interesting tidbits in those trade figures?
There's a real head-scratcher when it comes to imports,
Denmark's imports from China actually plummeted in 2023,
decreasing by 30.1%.
while imports from the U.S. increased by 9.9%.
Now that is interesting.
What's going on there?
It's difficult to say for certain without further analysis,
But it could point to a strategic shift in sourcing.
with Danish companies potentially diversifying their supply chains in response to the trade tensions.
Or could simply reflect changes in demand for specific goods.
It makes you wonder what's happening behind the scenes, right?
What decisions are these Danish companies making in response to this shifting global trade landscape?
Precisely.
And that's where a deeper dive into individual sectors and company strategies becomes really insightful.
Fascinating stuff. Okay, before we get too deep into the weeds of specific industries,
Let's loop back to something you specifically asked about.
Trump's proposed reciprocal act.
If I remember correctly, this is about leveling the playing field on tariffs between the U.S. and the EU.
You're right.
Essentially, it aimed to ensure that tariffs imposed by the U.S. on EU goods were met with equal tariffs on U.S. goods entering the EU.
DI actually modeled the potential impact of this act.
And their analysis suggests the overall effect on the Danish economy would be relatively small,
About a 2 billion DKK decrease in GDP.
and a loss of around 400 jobs.
So a bit of a bump in the road, but not a major economic earthquake.
Exactly.
Especially when you compare it to those trade war scenarios we discussed earlier.
But, and this is a crucial but,
DI emphasizes that this overall impact
while seemingly small,
would mask some significant pain points for certain sectors and companies.
yeah, I knew there had to be a catch.
So it's not all smooth sailing, even if the Reciprocal Act sounds pretty tame compared to a full-blown trade war.
That's the thing about these broad economic models.
They give you a good overview, but it's when you zoom in
When you look at the micro-level impact on specific industries and businesses,
that the real story emerges.
and in this case, the story is far from over.
So if we're talking about specific sectors feeling the heat,
Who exactly is in the hot seat?
if this Reciprocal Act were to become a reality,
Well, according to DI's projections,
Danish exports of enzymes, for instance.
could get hit with a 9.3% tariff increase.
And it's not just enzymes.
Aircraft parts could be looking at a 2.7% hike.
And even some food products might face a 2.8% increase.
Okay, so for those companies operating in those specific sectors,
The Reciprocal Act is more than just a blip on the radar.
it's a real threat to their bottom line.
Exactly.
It highlights the importance of looking beyond those top-line figures.
And understanding how these trade policy shifts,
Can create winners and losers.
even within a relatively small and open economy like Denmark's.
It really drives home that point about interconnectedness we were talking about earlier, doesn't it?
This idea that even seemingly small changes in one part of the global trade system
Can ripple out and have a significant impact on specific industries and companies elsewhere.
Absolutely.
And that's why it's so crucial for Danish businesses.
Especially those operating in sectors that are particularly exposed to these trade tensions.
To be proactive,
If they stay informed,
to diversify their markets,
to explore alternative sourcing options.
and to constantly adapt their strategies to this shifting landscape.
So it's not just about weathering the storm.
It's about learning to navigate those choppy waters.
And maybe even finding new opportunities amidst the uncertainty.
It reminds me of how Denmark adapted during the oil crises of the 70s.
Or the global financial crisis in '08.
They always seem to find a way to land on their feet.
That's a great point.
Denmark has this remarkable track record of resilience and adaptability,
They've faced economic headwinds before,
and they've consistently found ways to not only survive,
but to thrive.
it's like they've got this inner economic compass that keeps them oriented,
Even when the world around them is in turmoil.
and that compass is fueled by a few key factors.
Yes. A highly skilled workforce.
A strong tradition of innovation.
And a willingness to embrace change.
Those are the things that will ultimately determine how well Denmark weathers these current trade tensions.
So there's hope yet.
But let's zoom out for a second.
And connect the dots on what we've covered so far.
We've talked about the global trade landscape
The potential for trade wars.
and the specific challenges and opportunities these present for Denmark.
What are the key takeaways here?
Well, first and foremost,
It's clear that global trade tensions,
particularly those simmering between the U.S. and China.
Are casting a long shadow over the global economy.
And Denmark is certainly not immune to those effects.
And we've seen how those tensions can manifest in real economic consequences.
From potential decreases in GDP and job losses,
To increased uncertainty and volatility in the markets.
we've also seen how interconnected the global trade system really is.
What happens in one part of the world?
Can ripple out and impact countries and industries that might seem worlds away.
Right. It's not just about the direct trade relationships,
It's about those second and third order effects that can often be the most difficult to predict.
but have the potential to be the most impactful. It's like that old saying,
When elephants fight, it's the grass that gets trampled.
in this case, the grass.
Those Danish companies caught in the crossfire.
They're not just passive bystanders, are they?
Not at all.
And that's the encouraging takeaway here.
We've talked about Denmark's historical resilience.
Their knack for innovation.
This isn't just luck.
It's about recognizing the shifting tides and adapting,
Whether that's diversifying markets
finding new sourcing options.
or even pioneering entirely new products and industries,
So instead of just bracing for impact,
they're learning to ride the waves.
exactly.
Remember those pharmaceutical exports we discussed?
That sector is a prime example of Danish companies carving out their niche in the global market.
But it's not just about the big players.
Think about those smaller businesses facing higher tariffs under something like the Reciprocal Act.
What can they do?
Well, maybe it's about focusing on specialized products.
Tapping into niche markets less vulnerable to these broad trade disputes,
Or it could be about forming strategic partnerships
even with competitors.
to share costs and navigate these complexities together.
It's like they need to be nimble, adaptable.
Ready to pivot at a moment's notice.
Precisely.
And that's where staying informed
Understanding the nuances of these trade dynamics.
becomes so critical.
Because knowledge, as they say, is power.
It equips you to make those strategic decisions
To anticipate those shifts in the global trade winds,
and to ultimately chart a course towards success.
even amidst the uncertainty.
Okay, so if we're going to leave our listener with one final thought,
Something to really chew on.
what would it be?
Remember that Reciprocal Act we discussed?
How it seemed like a relatively minor threat to the overall Danish economy.
Well, here's something to ponder.
Could that act
Even if ultimately never implemented.
be a harbinger of things to come?
A signal that the rules of the global trade game are changing.
And if so, what does that mean for Danish companies?
Are they prepared to play by these new rules?
To adapt and thrive in this evolving landscape.
It's like we often focus on the big trade wars.
The headline-grabbing disputes.
But sometimes it's those smaller policy shifts
Those subtle changes in the trade winds.
that can have the most profound impact down the line.
Absolutely.
And by recognizing that,
By understanding the interconnectedness of it all,
and by embracing that spirit of adaptability and innovation,
Danish companies, and indeed all of us navigating this complex global system.
can weather the storms and emerge stronger on the other side.
Beautifully said.
It's a reminder that in the world of global trade,
The only constant is change.
and those who can adapt
Who can ride the waves of that change?
are the ones who will ultimately thrive.
And on that note,
We'll drop anchor on this deep dive.
until next time,
Keep exploring
keep asking those insightful questions,
and keep navigating those choppy
but ultimately fascinating.
waters of global trade.